For Father's Day, my wife gave me one of those Ancestry DNA kits. It was meant to be a fun joke. But 2 weeks later, a result came back that didn't make sense. A missing match that should have been there. Father's Day came with the usual fanfare, burnt toast, glitter-covered cards, and a surprise gift from my wife, Lindsay. She handed it to me with a smirk and said, "Hope you're ready to meet some Viking cousins." I laughed. It was one of those Ancestry DNA kits, the kind people buy for fun to learn they're 3% Irish or descended from goat herders. I didn't think much of it. I spat in the tube, mailed it off, and forgot about it. 2 weeks later, an email popped up while I was eating lunch at work. "Your ancestry results are in." I clicked it open, expecting a colorful pie chart and maybe a vague health warning about caffeine. But instead, I stared at a list of DNA matches that didn't include one person who absolutely should have been there. My son, Josh. It didn't compute. I hit refresh, logged out, logged back in. Still no match. Josh is 10. My mini-me. Everyone always said he looked just like me. Same chin, same stubborn eyes. But DNA doesn't lie. And what stared back at me was a void. Like someone had quietly erased a piece of me and hoped I wouldn't notice. That night, I couldn't stop watching him. Josh, laughing on the couch, trying to beat a level in some game. His brow furrowed in concentration. I tried to find something, anything, that proved he was mine. But suddenly, every familiar feature looked borrowed. Like a painting with the signature smudged. I didn't say anything to Lindsay. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But how do you start that conversation? "Hey honey, remember that gift you gave me?" Turns out it might have exposed the biggest lie of my life. Instead, I pretended everything was fine. Ate dinner. Watched TV. Kissed her goodnight with a smile so forced it hurt my jaw. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The fan spun overhead like a slow countdown, and my thoughts circled with it. Could there be a mistake in the results? Was there a glitch? Or was it something worse? Something deliberate? The next morning, I called the company and asked if there could have been a mix-up. They checked. They were polite. But no, the results were accurate. The match wasn't missing because of a lab error. It was missing because there was no genetic connection. I didn't eat much that day. Couldn't. My stomach felt like it was trying to fold in on itself. I kept checking the test again, hoping the data would change if I just stared hard enough. Didn't. And then came the questions. Silent, venomous questions that slithered through my mind when I looked at Lindsay. Where were you 10 years ago? What were you doing the night we celebrated moving into our first home? Why did your best friend Tom start showing up so often around then? I hadn't thought of Tom in years. He moved away, got married, fell off our radar. But now his face kept creeping into my memory. His laugh. The way Lindsay used to brighten when he came around, too bright. Like a candle lit just for him. That night, I looked through old photos. And there it was. Josh, barely a toddler, in my arms at his first birthday. And behind us, blurry, almost out of frame, Tom. Standing a little too close to Lindsay. Looking a little too familiar. My hand trembled as I zoomed in. That smile. His eyes. Josh's eyes. My world didn't collapse that night. It just tilted. As if someone had quietly turned the floor beneath me, and now everything slid sideways. Lindsay noticed. She asked if I was feeling okay. Said I looked pale. I told her I was fine. I lied, because something had changed. And I needed answers. There's no biological relationship to this child. I reread it a dozen times. My hands trembled. My son. Wasn't my son? But he had to be. He looked like me. It wasn't even a full report. Just a single line in a sterile email. There is no biological relationship to this child. I read it once, twice, a third time, then 12 more, until the words blurred into nothing but lines and shapes on a screen. I sat at my desk in total silence, the cursor blinking beside those words like a heartbeat, like the pulse of some cruel joke the universe decided to play. Josh wasn't mine, but he had to be. He had to be. The thought alone felt like blasphemy. I'd been there for every fever, every soccer game, every skinned knee. He clung to my leg when he was scared of thunder. He called me Dad with that effortless certainty only children have. the kind you don't question until the ground vanishes beneath you. I looked up, expecting the world to look different. Didn't. The sun still hung in the sky. The clock still ticked. But everything inside me shifted. It was like stepping off an elevator and finding no floor beneath you. That brief, weightless panic before the fall. That night at dinner, I watched him shovel macaroni into his mouth like it was the greatest culinary achievement on earth. He joked about something a classmate said, completely unaware that I was memorizing him. His voice. His laugh. The way his front tooth was slightly crooked, a trait I thought came from my side of the family. Every little thing about him was suddenly suspicious. Not because of what he did, but because of what she might have done. Lindsay sat across from me, cutting her chicken like it was any other Tuesday. Her expression calm. Content. Oblivious. And that's when the first fracture formed, a tiny crack I could feel but not yet see. After Josh went to bed, I sat on the porch, the DNA result open again on my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen like maybe if I pressed hard enough, the truth would reverse itself. That there'd be an apology from the lab. A correction. A glitch in the matrix. But no. There was only that sentence. The one that shattered everything. There's no biological relationship to this child. My thoughts ran wild. Was it a one-night stand? An old flame? A mistake she buried and hoped I'd never dig up? And worse, did she know? That question wrapped around me like ice. Did she know the whole time? Had I built my life on a lie someone else whispered into existence behind my back? Suddenly, everything felt contaminated. Memories we'd made, places we'd been, they now felt like crime scenes. And Lindsay was no longer just my wife. She was the primary suspect in a betrayal I hadn't even begun to understand. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe beside me like she hadn't just detonated a landmine beneath our marriage. At 3:27 a.m., I got up and pulled out the old photo albums. I flipped through the pages slowly. Birthdays. Christmases. First steps. First Halloween. Josh in a pirate costume clinging to my leg. There was one photo I kept coming back to, Lindsay in the hospital bed, holding newborn Josh. Her smile was tired but radiant. I stood beside her, hand on her shoulder, proud, unknowing. And in the corner, barely visible, a visitor. A man. The face too blurry to make out. Why hadn't I noticed him before? I zoomed in. My stomach dropped. It was Tom. Of course it was. I closed the album and sat in the dark, the silence pressing in on me like a secret trying to scream. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. She knew. She had to. And yet she still called me Dad. Still handed me that DNA kit like it was a joke. Like it was safe. She had no idea she'd handed me the fuse to her own undoing. When I asked my wife about it, she went pale. She didn't deny it. She just whispered, "I never meant for you to find out." And just like that, the illusion shattered. I always thought if this moment ever came, I'd be furious. I wasn't. I was still cold. Like the silence that settles after a glass breaks but before anyone moves. I'd rehearsed the question 100 times in my head. Tried to find a version that didn't sound accusatory, that didn't feel like I was setting a trap. But when the moment came, it spilled out of me like water through a crack. "Lindsay, is there any reason the test would say Josh isn't biologically mine?" She looked up from her coffee. Confused at first. Then, slowly, her face drained of color. Like she'd seen a ghost. She didn't ask what test. She didn't feign shock. She didn't reach for a lie. She just sat there, eyes wide, breath caught, and whispered, "I never meant for you to find out." I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. Because in that moment I realized something terrifying. She was relieved. Not sorry. Not ashamed. Just relieved the hiding was over. The illusion cracked right down the middle, clean and brutal. All these years I believed in the story we built, the marriage, the family, the late-night feedings and morning cuddles, and with one sentence it became fiction. I stared at her, hoping she'd lie. Because a lie meant she still cared about keeping the story intact. A lie meant she was still fighting to protect the world we'd built, even if it was with trembling hands and broken pieces. But the truth? The truth was quiet. And final. She looked away. Couldn't hold my gaze? Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee mug, but she didn't drink from it. She just held it. Like maybe if she clung to that one ordinary object, she could pretend this was still a normal morning. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She flinched. Just a flicker. But it was there. She didn't answer right away. Just pressed her lips together and stared out the kitchen window as if the words were hiding somewhere in the trees. "Tom," she said finally. And there it was. The name I had buried in suspicion now unearthed like a landmine. My mouth went dry. Was it one time? Another silence. Then a slow, broken nod. Yes. Just once. But I didn't believe her. Because one time doesn't make you cry in the shower the next day. One time doesn't make you hide phone calls or flinch when someone says his name. One time doesn't haunt you for 10 years unless it wasn't just one time. I wanted to scream. To rage. To flip the table and demand more than that pathetic whisper of an answer. But I couldn't move. Because something deeper was breaking. Not just my trust. Not just our marriage. But me. She started to cry. Quietly. The kind of tears people shed when they know the executioner is just out of frame. I was scared, she said. I didn't think he. I didn't know who. Her voice cracked and dissolved into a sob. I didn't comfort her. I just stared. Because she wasn't crying for what she did. She was crying because she got caught. And that difference matters. Josh's footsteps came from upstairs. Light, carefree, innocent. Lindsay wiped her eyes and stood up quickly, trying to collect herself. But it was too late. The curtain had been pulled back, and I could never unsee the truth. I always thought he was mine from the start. But she told me the truth. She was pregnant when we met, and she let me believe I was the father. You were perfect, she said. We needed you. I used to think I was there from the beginning. The hospital. The tiny socks. The first word. I believed I was part of his first heartbeat, that my name was the first one etched into his sense of safety. But I wasn't. I wasn't even in the picture yet. The truth came quietly. Almost gently. As if whispering it could soften the blow. He was already two, she said, barely above her breath. When we met, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was surgical. It carved everything open. I looked at her, expecting some sign of remorse. But she just stared at the floor like the past had spilled out and now she was watching it pool around her feet. You were perfect, she added, as if that was supposed to comfort me. We needed you. Not I loved you. Not it happened so fast. Just we needed you. Like I'd been recruited. Drafted into a role I never auditioned for. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it pressing into my spine like gravity had increased. 2 years old. That meant all those photos we took when I thought I was capturing firsts? They were just replacements. Cover-ups. Versions of something someone else had already seen. His first birthday cake, that wasn't his first. The first time I held him, that wasn't the beginning. That wasn't even mine. I tried to picture her back then. Pregnant. Alone. Or maybe not alone, maybe still with him. Tom. The ghost hiding in the negative space of our memories. Did she know? Did she plan it? Or was I just convenient? I remember the day we met. She was radiant, kind in the way that felt rare. We clicked. Laughed. Talked for hours. She told me she'd had a rough few years but never explained. I didn't press. Love makes you overlook the blanks in someone's story. But now those blanks scream. Because while I thought I was falling in love with someone starting a future, she was still hiding her past. She never told me she was pregnant. Never said a word about Tom. She let me fall into the illusion, gently, patiently, until it was too late to climb back out. I was scared, she said again, like fear was permission to rewrite history. I didn't know how to raise a child alone. And then you came along and you were so good, so kind. You just fit. Like a puzzle piece. Like I was a character she'd cast before the curtain even rose. The more she spoke, the less I recognized her. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I married, she wouldn't have let me believe a lie this big. Not for this long. Not this deeply. But this woman? This one sitting across from me explaining my own life back to me? She was a stranger wearing my wife's face. I thought of Josh. His laughter. His hugs. The way he ran to me after school. None of that changed. But everything behind it had. I used to think I was his beginning. Now I realized. I was just his chapter 2. He ran into my arms like always, laughing, calling me dad. But now I knew. And suddenly every hug, every memory felt like it belonged to someone else. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see him through the front window silhouetted by the glow of cartoons, sprawled out on the living room rug like gravity didn't apply to children. He looked up as I walked in. Dad, he yelled, bolting toward me like he always did, arms wide, barefoot and happy. I caught him midair, instinctively like muscle memory. His arms wrapped around my neck. His laugh rang out. But something inside me didn't catch up. Because now, I knew. And knowing changes everything. I held him, but it felt like I was borrowing someone else's child. Like I had stepped into the wrong life and everyone was too polite to tell me. His weight in my arms used to feel like peace. Now it felt like a question I couldn't answer. He looked up at me and smiled, that toothy grin that always melted my stress away. It still did. But now it melted into something else. Something hollow. Was this what he saw too? Did Tom ever hold him like this? Did he know? Did he care? I kissed the top of Josh's head and smiled the same way I always had, trying not to let the fracture show. But inside I was unraveling. Because now every memory felt counterfeit. His first steps, were they my first steps with him? His first words, had he already said them to someone else? Was I just rewatching someone else's life through a filter? I sat down with him on the couch and he leaned into me, comfortable and safe. And I realized he didn't know. To him, nothing had changed. He didn't care about DNA. He didn't care about biology. He just saw me. His dad. And that's what made it worse. Because I didn't know if I could keep being that man, now that I knew I wasn't. I felt like a fraud. Like I had stumbled into a role meant for someone else and now I couldn't leave the stage without breaking his heart. And I couldn't look at Lindsay. Not tonight. She came in from the kitchen and paused when she saw us, me and Josh, on the couch, wrapped in a silence thicker than usual. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw it. The guilt. The weight of everything she didn't say. I looked away. Because if I kept looking, I might say something I couldn't take back. Later that night, after Josh fell asleep on my chest, I sat there long after I should have moved him to bed. I just held him, listening to his breath, feeling the tiny rise and fall of a chest that used to be my legacy. Now, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I was. A father? A placeholder? A casualty of someone else's secret? I closed my eyes and held him tighter. Because even though the truth had changed everything, he hadn't. Not yet. I tracked him down. The biological father. He didn't even know the boy existed. And the moment I saw his face, the resemblance was undeniable. I never wanted to become this version of myself. The one who digs through old social media posts, checks alumni directories, cross-references photos and timestamps like some half-mad detective chasing shadows. But when your entire life starts to feel like a forgery, you start looking for the original. It didn't take long to find him. Tom. She hadn't mentioned his name in years. I thought that meant he'd faded into the background, a forgotten friend, a harmless footnote. But now I knew better. He wasn't a footnote. He was the prologue. I found an old address buried in a business profile, some freelance consulting gig out of state. I didn't call him. I didn't send a message. I got in the car and drove. Because this wasn't something I could read in a text or hear in a voicemail. I needed to see him. When I pulled up to the cafe where he worked part-time, I didn't know what I expected. Maybe someone older. Worn. Someone who had moved on like the rest of us. But when I saw him, my heart sank. Because I saw my son's eyes. Not mine. His. Same sharp corners. Same expression when he furrowed his brow. Even the way he laughed, it was Josh. Not mimicked. Not taught. Just there. Undeniable. Tom spotted me as I approached. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? Can I help you? He asked, polite but cautious. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. My name's Daniel, I said. We need to talk. He glanced at my face again. A flicker of something passed behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or confusion. We sat at a corner table. I could barely hear myself over the storm of thoughts thundering in my skull. But I pushed forward. Slowly. Carefully. I think you knew my wife, I said. Lindsay. About 10 years ago. That did it. His face shifted. A flicker of guilt. Surprise. Something deeper. And then I asked, did you know she had a son? He blinked. A son, he said. Lindsay had a kid? I studied him, waiting for a crack in the act. But he looked genuinely confused. She never told you? He shook his head slowly. We broke things off. She said she needed time to figure things out. I never heard from her again. My stomach dropped. All this time I thought I was the replacement. But now I realized he wasn't part of the plan. He never even knew. And suddenly Lindsay's words echoed back, clearer than ever. We needed you. Not we chose you. Not we loved you. We needed you. Because he was gone. And I was there. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a photo, a recent one of Josh. It was creased from how many times I'd stared at it in private, wondering what was real. Tom took it. And the moment he saw it, everything stopped. His jaw clenched. His eyes widened. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't say, that can't be. He just whispered, oh my God. I saw it hit him. The boy he never met. The years he never got. And in that moment, I didn't hate him. How could I? He wasn't the villain. He was just another casualty of her silence. He looked at me, eyes glassy. Is he okay? I nodded. He's a good kid, I said quietly. He thinks I'm his father. Tom swallowed hard. And for the first time in days, I felt something unexpected. Pity. Because in one moment, I'd lost everything I thought I knew. But Tom? He never even got the chance. Please don't ruin this. Don't ruin us. She cried like her life depended on it. But was I really the one ruining everything? Or was I just uncovering what was already broken? She stood in the doorway, arms folded like she was holding herself together with tension alone. Her mascara had started to run, not from neglect, but from panic. The kind that hits when the lie you swore would stay buried starts clawing its way to the surface. "You went to see him?" she asked, her voice small. I didn't answer. The silence was louder than anything I could have said. She stepped forward, her voice cracking like old paint. "Please, don't do this. Don't tell him. Tell him." The irony of those words hit like a gut punch. She was the one who kept the truth from both of us. She made the decision to let a man raise a child without knowing he wasn't the father, and let another man go on with his life, unaware he had a son. But now I was the villain for pulling the curtain back. "Please, Daniel," she pleaded again. "Don't ruin this. Don't ruin us." That word used to mean something. A vow, a team, a home. Now it sounded like a negotiation, a plea to keep the house of cards from collapsing. I stared at her, and all I could see was the unraveling. "You don't understand," she whispered, stepping closer. "I was alone. I was scared. Tom left and I didn't know what to do. And then, you came into my life and you were everything we needed. Not me and you." She was still speaking in terms of necessity, like I'd been a solution to a problem, not a person with a heart she just borrowed. "He doesn't have to know," she said. "Please, think about Josh." And that's what shattered me the most. Because I was thinking about Josh. Every second. Every breath. That's why this hurt so badly. Because this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about identity. About the foundation he stood on, the one we both did. And if I kept this secret for her sake, I wasn't protecting him. I was participating in the lie. She cried harder then. And not quiet tears. The kind that came from deep in the chest, raw and ugly. "Don't take him from me," she said. "Don't blow this up." I didn't respond right away. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. Not out of anger, but restraint. Because part of me wanted to scream. To ask her how she could look me in the eye for 10 years and say I love you with a secret like this locked behind her teeth. But I didn't scream. I just asked quietly, "When were you going to tell him?" "When he turned 18. When he walked your aisle at his wedding and didn't know the man in the second row was his real father." She shook her head. "He doesn't need to know. He loves you. You're his father." I swallowed hard. Because I wanted to believe that. I really, really did. But love doesn't erase truth. And silence doesn't fix fractures. It just hides them until they cave in. She dropped to her knees then, sobbing. Not for me. Not for Tom. But for control. Because that was slipping away. And the truth? The truth was already out. I wasn't ruining anything. I was just turning the lights on. Every night, I stared at the ceiling, torn. Was I a fool holding on to someone else's child? Or a father who didn't need biology to matter? Sleep became a stranger. I'd lie in bed, the room dark and quiet, except for the hum of a fan and the soft rise and fall of breathing beside me, hers. Still sharing the same bed. Still wearing the same wedding ring. As if nothing had happened. But everything had. Every night, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the same question in my mind like a song stuck on a broken loop. What am I now? A father? A placeholder? A fool? Some nights I'd get up and check on Josh, quietly like a thief stealing moments. I'd stand in his doorway and watch him sleep. His face calm, peaceful, unburdened. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of a child who's never questioned the ground beneath him. And I'd think, does he deserve to know? Or does he deserve to be protected from the truth that could shatter him? Because he didn't ask for this. He didn't ask to be born into a secret. He didn't ask for a mother who built a story on omission or a father who suddenly didn't know how to hold his own reflection. Couldn't eat. Everything tasted like static. I'd sit at the table with a full plate and an empty appetite while Lindsay moved around the kitchen like a ghost rehearsing her old role, pretending things hadn't changed. But I had. I couldn't look at family photos without dissecting them. I couldn't say I love you without wondering if it was mine to give. Every memory became a hall of mirrors. Familiar. Warped. Fragile. People say being a parent is about love, not blood. And maybe that's true. But love built on a lie? That's a different kind of weight. A love that was given freely without conditions, now asked to carry the weight of deception. Was I strong enough for that? I remember Josh's birthday last year, the way he lit up when I surprised him at school, how he ran across the playground into my arms like nothing else in the world mattered. That moment wasn't fake. That joy wasn't borrowed. It was real. And yet, the foundation beneath it wasn't. That's what made it so hard. This wasn't some clean, clinical betrayal. This was tangled. Messy. It had fingerprints from all directions, hers, his, mine. And in the center of it all was a little boy who just wanted to play video games, eat cereal, and fall asleep knowing his dad was right down the hall. I wanted to be that dad. I was that dad. But now, I didn't know if I could keep being him without breaking a little more each day. The world kept turning. Bills kept coming. Josh still asked me to help with homework and begged for one more bedtime story. Life didn't pause to let me grieve. And that was the cruelest part. Because I was grieving something no one could see. I hadn't lost my son, but I had lost the belief that he was mine. One night, as I tucked him in, he looked up and whispered, "I'm glad you're my dad." That moment broke me and healed me all at once. It had been weeks. Weeks of quiet stares. Of half-finished dinners. Of pretending life hadn't cracked down the middle and swallowed me whole. Lindsay and I barely spoke. Not because of anger, not anymore, but because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been undone by the truth. But Josh? Josh was untouched by all of it. Still asking if I'd build Lego towers. Still waking me up on Saturdays with cartoons and cereal breath. Still calling me dad like the word was carved into his DNA. And maybe it was. That night, I tucked him in like always. The routine had never changed. He liked his sheets pulled up just under his chin, one stuffed animal on each side like they were his tiny bodyguards. Then came the water check, the light dimmed just right, and finally, the soft, "Good night, buddy." But before I could say it, he looked up at me, wide-eyed, serious in a way that didn't match his age. And he whispered it. "I'm glad you're my dad." 6 words. They landed like a meteor. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared at him, this little person who didn't know the weight of what he'd just said or how it cracked something open in my chest that had been sealed tight with doubt and grief. That moment didn't erase the pain, but it rewrote the ending. Because I realized something I hadn't let myself believe until then. He chose me. Not with words. Not consciously. But every laugh, every tear, every scraped knee and bedtime story, they were choices. Quiet, consistent choices. He chose me to be the one he trusted, the one he reached for, the one he ran to when the world felt too big. I leaned down, kissed his forehead, and whispered back, "I'm glad, too." Then I walked into the hallway, shut the door softly behind me. And broke. Not from anger, but from release. All this time, I thought knowing the truth would unmake everything. That once I knew he wasn't mine by blood, I couldn't love him the same way. But that night, he reminded me love doesn't ask for credentials. It just shows up. And I had shown up. Every day. Even now. I wasn't a placeholder. I was his father. Not because Lindsay said so. Not because biology gave me permission. But because he did. And that somehow was enough. I didn't tell him. I didn't walk away. Some truths destroy more than they fix. And in the end, being his father was never about DNA. It was about never leaving, even when it hurt. The test still sits in the back of my desk drawer. Unread, unopened, but never forgotten. Some nights I still find myself reaching for it, half tempted to tear it apart or read it again, like the words might change if I stare long enough. But they don't. They never will. And neither will I. I never told Josh. I thought I might, that someday the moment would arrive, heavy with honesty, cloaked in good intentions. But that moment never came. And maybe that's the point. Not all truths are meant to be spoken. Some of them only exist to test us, to ask whether we value being right more than we value being whole. I chose whole. I chose him. Not because I had to. Not because Lindsay begged me to. But because when he calls me dad, there's no asterisk. No condition. No shadow of another man standing behind the word. There's just me. I think people assume love is this clean thing. Something pure and weightless. But real love, the kind you earn over scraped knees and sleepless nights, it's messy. It hurts. It asks more of you than it gives back, sometimes. And yet, I never stopped showing up. Even when it hurt. Even when I felt like an actor in a role someone else was born to play. Because in that pain, I found purpose. I don't see Tom's face when Josh laughs anymore. I just see Josh. And I see the life we built, birthdays and homework and long drives filled with silly songs. 1,000 tiny choices that have nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with staying when you could have left. As for Lindsay, we're still together. Some days are harder than others. Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once. It's a hallway you walk down every day, deciding whether you're willing to keep going. I don't forget what she did, but I no longer let it define what we are now. We made something real out of a lie, and somehow that doesn't make it less true. It just makes it more human. People ask me if I ever think about what might have been. If I wish I'd walked away. Started over. And maybe in some parallel life I did. But not in this one. In this one, I chose to stay. To hold on. To be the father he believed I was, the one I decided to be. Because in the end, fatherhood isn't something that lives in your blood. It lives in the quiet moments. In the staying. In the breaking and still choosing to rebuild. I chose love over blood. And I do it again.